All right, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the July Restoring Neighborhoods Task Force webinar. My name is Nathan Park, and we are going to get started with today's webinar. So just a quick agenda. We're going to do some brief introductions. We're going to have a quick update from the National Housing Conference President and CEO, David Dorkin. And then we're going to launch into a great presentation that we have for you all today on housing and natural disasters. We're going to have two presenters, Sonya Acosta, who is a policy analyst at the National Low-Income Housing Coalition, and Shana OShaughnessy, who is the president of the Community Housing Improvement Program. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to David.
Hey, everybody. Thank you for joining us. I just wanted to jump on and say that this is a really important subject matter for us, and many of you know that we are working with our members to draft a National Housing Act for the 21st century. Climate impact is a key element of this. I think that policymakers often get tied up in knots over climate change issues because they often involve significant funding questions around how to mitigate climate change and how to avoid additional contributions to it. This is a case where climate impact is happening now. When we have a 500-year flood happening every 5 years, or fires like we've seen recently in California that are clearly climate related, we really have to think more, I think, proactively, because we're already spending the money and we're not always spending it as smartly as we could. So thank you all for attending. I'm looking forward to hearing the presentation myself, and we always appreciate your interest in these webinars.
Great, thank you, David. And so before I turn it over to our two presenters, just some quick technical details. So as with all of our webinars, we love for these to be as interactive as possible. We have some great information coming from our presenters, and we want everyone who has questions to be engaged with us. So on your little toolbox with the GoToWebinar service, there should be a question box that looks like what is being presented on the screen right now. So throughout any point of the webinar, if you have questions, please ask them through this question box, and we will get to them after the presentation is complete. Additionally, a link to view the presentation and download the slides will be emailed out to everyone who has registered. So if you have questions specific about content in the slides, also know that you'll get access to these slides after the presentation is finished. And then finally, if you have any technical issues with the GoToWebinar service, you can just check out this web link, support.citrixonline.com, for any support, and hopefully you can figure it out there. So with all of that, I am now going to turn it over to Sonya, who is going to kick off our presentation.
All right, thank you so much, Nathan, and thank you to National Housing Conference for having me. Just pulling up my slideshow here. All right, so you should be able to see that. And before I get started into kind of talking about the federal disaster recovery process and how low-income people interact with that system, I just wanted to give a little bit of background about National Low-Income Housing Coalition and our Disaster Housing Recovery Coalition. Lots of coalitions. So in case you're not familiar, National Low-Income Housing Coalition is dedicated solely to achieving socially just public policy that ensures people with the lowest incomes in the United States have affordable and decent homes. Starting after Hurricane Harvey in 2017, we founded the Disaster Housing Recovery Coalition, which now includes over 800 organizations who are dedicated to ensuring the federal response to disaster recovery prioritizes the housing needs of the lowest income people in impacted areas. And this work has been really wonderful, and I've been leading it for some time, and actually have recently been handing it over somewhat to a colleague named Noah Patton. And I'm going to have his contact info at the end of this whole presentation. And so questions for me should also probably include him since we are kind of tag teaming it at the moment. Okay, so I'm just going to give kind of an overview of how the federal disaster recovery process works, and then talk about some of the resources and gaps for low-income survivors, since that's really the focus of both the National Low-Income Housing Coalition and our Disaster Housing Recovery Coalition. So first, this is a pretty general timeline of how federal resources kind of get activated for a disaster. So you have a disaster, and then governors submit requests to the White House for a disaster declaration, and that could either be an emergency declaration or a major disaster declaration. The president will approve this request and specify what types of assistance the state and which counties are eligible for what types of assistance through FEMA. And so FEMA is, of course, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, and they are the primary agency that works with disasters for the federal government, and they really work with states and local governments to do some of the immediate response after a disaster. They also provide individual assistance, and survivors can also apply for assistance through Small Business Administration, which provides low-interest loans to survivors. Department of Agriculture will provide disaster SNAP benefits. HUD always issues a moratorium on foreclosures. A bunch of different agencies play some type of role in the federal response to a disaster, although a lot of it is really through FEMA, and FEMA in some ways coordinates certain things. And so that's kind of the administration side. And then as far as looking at Congress's main role is really providing additional funding as necessary. And I'm going to kind of focus, since we're talking about housing, focusing on the funding through HUD. And the main program for that is called the Community Development Block Grant Disaster Recovery Program, or CDBGDR. I've gotten really good at saying that acronym, but it is a bit of a mouthful. So that's just a general overview of kind of the timeline of how things get started. So talking a little more about what assistance FEMA provides, there's two main types of assistance. One is public assistance, and that goes to municipal governments, state governments, county governments, and it's used more like a refund where, states do the work and FEMA provides like a cost share, and then states can apply for some funds through FEMA for emergency work and permanent work. A lot of this looks like debris removal or repairing infrastructure that was damaged during a disaster. On the other side, which is mainly where I'll be focusing, is the individual assistance. And this is done through the Individuals and Households Program Assistance. And there's different types of assistance that individuals can apply for through FEMA. You have housing assistance and other needs assistance. Housing assistance can either be financial or direct. And so financial assistance would be money for rent, money to repair your home, things like that. Whereas direct assistance is actually a temporary housing unit like FEMA trailers, or thinking about directly leasing homes for folks. And then other needs assistance is kind of a catch-all that would provide assistance for medical costs, childcare. It's a little more flexible. However, FEMA assistance isn't always the best and most accessible for low-income folks. They often fall through the cracks and either don't receive the assistance that they're entitled to, or receive much less than what they really need to get back on their feet. And there's a few different reasons for that. I've listed some of them here. So thinking about documentation requirements, low-income folks are more likely to lack official documents. Maybe they don't have a formal title, or they're not on a lease, or they have some kind of informal leasing arrangement that doesn't have strict documentation, and FEMA requires that for assistance. This applies for everyone, that just households lose papers during disasters, and just generally speaking, people who were experiencing homelessness prior to disaster are not eligible for FEMA assistance, even though they are still greatly impacted by natural disasters, but because they can't show an address or kind of proof that they lost things in the disaster, they end up not being eligible for assistance. There's just generally also a lack of affordable housing, and when you have a disaster, you lose even more affordable housing, and that can make it really difficult for low-income folks to actually use the assistance that FEMA does provide. If they provide rental assistance, there may not be any place for them to actually use it, because folks with higher incomes might have already kind of moved into rental housing. Naturally occurring affordable housing is a little more susceptible to damage from a disaster, and so some of those things might be gone, and it's just a really difficult thing. And a lot of FEMA programs have a really short time frame as well. Rental assistance, it's really only covered for 2 months, and then you have to work with FEMA to extend it and extend it. And 2 months is not a lot of time to find a more permanent housing solution, especially in some of the more devastating disasters that we've seen recently, where you just have such a loss of housing, that finding anywhere to live is so incredibly hard, unless you leave. And there's some weird things about how much FEMA assistance is set, how it's set, and it makes it a little difficult to use that assistance elsewhere outside of the impacted area. Generally speaking, FEMA assistance only lasts for 18 months, and that's not generally enough time for recovery and rebuilding to really even get started, let alone a lot of new housing units becoming available for folks to move into, which is another huge issue. Low-income folks, of course, just have more limited resources, and it makes it much more difficult to navigate the FEMA process. They might have jobs that don't allow them to take a lot of time off, or they have very strict hours. And I read an article where it was kind of comparing two different families, a middle-income family and a low-income family. And the middle-income family could work with their employer. Their employer gave them paid time off to kind of go sort everything out, gave them like a bonus basically, that would allow their family to kind of stay afloat. Whereas the low-income person who worked, I think, at the postal office, they couldn't afford to take any time off and lose money by not going to work. And that made it really difficult to say go to one of the kind of field offices that FEMA sets up and sort things out and figure out what documentation they actually needed and what they were eligible for and how they could use those benefits in different ways and provide some and have FEMA provide some kind of case management services. So that alone makes it really difficult. And then kind of one of the big underlying things is just that FEMA assesses damages from the disaster and then provides assistance based on those damages. So folks with more assets have higher rates of damage and therefore receive more assistance. And so several studies have shown that disasters kind of exacerbate already existing inequities, both racial inequities and class inequities, because folks with more assets end up kind of coming out of a disaster a little better off. It takes some time, but in the long run, they end up with more wealth, where it's the opposite is true for low-income folks, that after disaster, even years out, they're still kind of struggling to recover. So that's the FEMA side of it, and now I'm going to talk a little bit about the HUD side. So like I mentioned before, the main source of funding through HUD for disaster recovery is the CDBGDR program, and that is an incredibly lengthy process. As you can see here, it just keeps going. And one of the reasons why it's so lengthy is because the program is not currently authorized in statute. And so each time there's a disaster, you have to do this entire process. And there's no way to kind of skip some of these things as the system is currently set up. So it starts with a disaster declaration from the president, and then Congress, of course, passes that aid package. And then HUD will take the funding that Congress appropriated and allocate it to the different impacted areas. Once they allocate it, then they put out a notice in the Federal Register kind of putting out the guidelines for that specific disaster of how each grantee needs to spend their funding. States then have to put together their action plans. And because the guidelines change for each disaster, states oftentimes do kind of have to start more or less from scratch, even if it's a state like Florida or Texas, where they've kind of gone through this process a lot. Because the guidelines change each time, they still have to go through and make adjustments, and obviously each disaster is also different, which adds to that. There's a public comment period once a state publishes its action plan, and then they submit it to HUD. HUD will approve or reject the plan, sign a grant agreement, and then states can finally access those funds. And so for the 2017 and 2018 disasters, most of them have gotten through this process, although I do kind of just want to flag for folks that Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands are stuck on the grant agreement stage, so they are not able to access a lot of those CDBGDR funds that Congress appropriated, more than a year ago, because they're just waiting for those final details to be ironed out. So obviously there are some issues with the current CDBGDR process. It's really long, and it takes a very long time to get through all of those steps and get that funding to the grantees so that they can actually do the work that they need to do. And that's incredibly difficult. Like I mentioned, requirements vary each time. There's kind of no place for grantees to look to and say, okay, I know this program works. This housing program works. I'm just going to kind of take it and utilize it. States grantees basically have to start from scratch each time with a new housing program, which can take even more time to set up and get ready. And it's just an incredibly lengthy process. And this whole time, you have survivors waiting desperately for housing. And like I mentioned, FEMA assistance is only 18 months. So if it takes about 18 months for states to even get the funding to start rebuilding, you're going to have a lot of people falling through the cracks during that time between FEMA assistance ending and new housing actually being built. There's also just generally a lack of oversight of grantees through this program. There's generally some requirements that 70% of funds need to be used for low to moderate income people, and sometimes states will use this funding in ways that cannot connect either to the disaster or to low income people. We've heard of stories of states on the Gulf Coast using CDBGDR funds to build parking structures, which were not in places that were even impacted by a disaster. And so that's definitely a big issue that HUD just doesn't really have the capacity to oversee grantees properly. I think there's only 24 people currently who work at HUD that work specifically on this program, and they oversee billions of dollars. So that's definitely an issue. And so, like I'm saying, there are plenty of places for people to kind of fall through the cracks and not be able to access either FEMA assistance, or they have to wait so long for HUD assistance. And even then, there's still some struggles to actually accessing that money. And so I just kind of wanted to highlight what that looks like is just an increase in homelessness. And so here's a map with some recent disasters, and you can see that homelessness has increased after disaster in a lot of these places. Most of these figures come from point-in-time counts, at least 6 months after the disaster. They all kind of vary. And you'll see for Hurricane Maria, it notes increases in homelessness in Massachusetts and Connecticut, which is not Puerto Rico, but a lot of people who were impacted by Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico moved to Massachusetts, Connecticut, and other states. And those states saw an increase in homelessness that they could directly connect to evacuees from Hurricane Maria. So that's kind of my overview of the federal response. And now I'm going to turn it over to Shana, who's going to go into more detail about what it looks like on the ground post-Camp Fire in Butte County, California.
Thank you. I am going to get started. Hi, so thank you so much. My name is Shana OShaughnessy, and as Sonya mentioned, I am going to bring the conversation to the local level. Many of the things that she highlighted in her presentation, we are absolutely experiencing on the ground, and it just strikes me that we unfortunately have so much experience with disaster across the nation, and it's unfortunate that the system still hasn't caught up with the needs that people have on the ground. So I am with CHIP, Community Housing Improvement Program. We are a nonprofit developer founded in 1973. We serve 7 counties in Northern California. It's primarily a rural region. Our headquarters are in Chico, California, which is located in Butte County, which is the county that was impacted by the Camp Fire. Our lines of business include multifamily development. We've built and rehabbed 18 properties, including a property that burned in Paradise, and we built and rehabbed 766 units. We property manage these developments, and we currently have 729 units under management, including 2 fee-managed properties. We provide on-site resident services at most of our properties. Our other primary line of business is our single-family home ownership development. We build homes primarily through the USDA Mutual Self-Help Program. We've done almost 2,000 units to date and currently have 64 homes either under construction or in our pipeline. This is Paradise Community Village. It was an incredibly hard to develop property. It took over 12 years. We were incredibly proud of this property. It was lovely, and we overcame a bunch of hurdles, including the fact that Paradise is not really designed for multifamily because it's on septic. It doesn't have sewer. And so the loss of this property was pretty deeply felt by us. So Butte County is a rural county located in Northern California. It's at the northern end of the Central Valley, which is California's agricultural hub. And then we're at the start of the Sierra Nevada foothills. The city of Chico is the anchor in Butte County. It has the largest population. The university is located here. It has a growing and relatively diverse economy. and really people looking for alternatives to the high cost of the Bay Area have found it an attractive place to relocate. The town of Paradise, which burned, is located about 20-30 minutes away from Chico. Generally, our region is lower income than the state average, but historically the cost of living was also relatively low, especially our housing. This affordability had been eroding over the last 10 to 15 years, especially in Chico. Prior to the Camp Fire, there was an increasing number of homeless individuals living in Chico and the county. Paradise has always been extremely affordable and an easy to commute to Chico. Historically, it served as a retirement community. Lots of people moved there upon retirement, but because of its affordability and proximity to Chico, the demographics had started to shift to a slightly younger population. But as you can see from the stats on the slide, it's still older than the state average. Our region is less diverse than the state average and tends to identify as conservative. Even with the increasing lack of affordability and increasing homeless population, support for affordable housing was pretty low prior to the Camp Fire. Our biggest employers are the university, county and city government, ag, and healthcare. Although recently there has been some growth in startups, including light manufacturing such as Clean Canteen and technology such as Build.com. And of course, we are well known for the Sierra Nevada Brewery. So the fire started in Polga, this small little town here. It's not even a town, at 6:30 a.m. By 8 a.m., it had traveled 6 miles as the crow flies. There's canyons in here to the eastern edge of Paradise, and evacuations had started. By 10:30, there were fires throughout the town of Paradise, and by 2:30, the entire town was burning. At the evening, we had evacuations for Durham and parts of Chico. So it was a pretty scary time. The fire burned incredibly fast, the equivalent of a football field each second. And we have other small communities. I mean, the town of Paradise is the community that's talked about the most, but there's Magalia, Concow, Yankee Hill, and several other communities that were burned. This is all mostly open space in here. So because of our demographics, as Sonya talked about on her slide about low-income households falling through the cracks, we are absolutely seeing this happening. Our lower income population, our type of housing stock that we had a high number of mobile home and manufactured homes, the economic profile of our region. Our population was extremely vulnerable to the effects of a natural disaster, especially wildfire, and lacked the resources to recover. And our lack of available housing, which Sonya also pointed out, has meant that there's nowhere for people to go. We still have families in the FEMA TSA program, temporary shelter assistance, which is hotel vouchers, 7 months after the fire, which is pretty rare. And a significant number of people remain marginally housed. The largest blocks of FEMA trailers are still scheduled to come online next month, early next month. And as Sonya pointed out, they're supposed to end 18 months after the disaster, which would be May or June 2020. So while there is opportunity to apply for extensions, it's just very stressful to rely on extensions and not know where people are going long term. So in addition to the loss of structures, housing, businesses, our infrastructure took a big hit. One of the scariest things was that for several months, our irrigation district thought that the entire water system was contaminated. Many people are still under warnings, so we can't cook, shower, wash clothes, brush teeth, do anything with the water because of benzene contamination from the heat of the fire. However, it is better news because the whole system is not contaminated and they can fix it as they go. One of the other big unknowns for us is the cost of insurance. And already we're seeing throughout California in other areas increasing premiums. And so the cost of insurance is a huge threat to affordability and the ability of people to decide to build back in the burn areas and even throughout the state. It is impossible to fully convey how deeply this disaster has impacted our region, both individuals, businesses, and just everyone in the community, those directly affected and those secondarily affected. It just cannot be emphasized enough. One of the hardest things about this disaster was that entire community networks were lost. So you had families, multiple generations of families, parents, grandparents, children, nieces, nephews, cousins, that all lost their homes. So then when people were looking for solutions and support, their regular networks that they could rely on were also impacted and suffering. So the reports do show that the majority of people have remained in Butte County, with Los Angeles absorbing the second highest number. But you can see that there's been a diaspora across the country of people moving and trying to relocate, which has an impact on our economy throughout Butte County. As Sonya mentioned, the increase in homelessness. So our point-in-time survey was scheduled for January 2019. It was postponed to the end of March. And while there was an increase reported, it truly is less than was expected and doesn't align with the experience of case managers across organizations. I participated in the survey, and a couple of the people that I talked to weren't even sure if they counted as homeless because they had an RV or they were living in a van on the property that they had owned before. So they were like, I don't know if I'm homeless. I have a roof over my head. Of the 23% that said they were impacted by the Camp Fire, this episode of homelessness was their first time being homeless because of the Camp Fire. So I talked about all the bad news, but there really still is there in Paradise and the surrounding areas. There are buildings that are still standing. People are repopulating the homes. There are more than 150 businesses that have already reopened. The first ground up rebuild has been finished and people are occupying. And while the infrastructure has been damaged, it wasn't completely destroyed. There is something to build off of. And we do believe that the town will come back and be a lovely place to live. However, one of our greatest challenges will be to ensure that it remains affordable to folks, that we haven't lost the deeply affordable housing that we had in the region. So the path forward, we absolutely need the support and funding of the federal government and the state and private philanthropy. There was a tremendous amount of generosity that of people donating into our community, and a lot of that money was deployed for emergency services, but the cost of building long-term housing is is expensive and we need more. I say here that CDBGDR is moving relatively quickly. On Sonia's slide of 10 steps, we're at step number 3, but so we'll see if it continues to move quickly. But there is a path forward, we see it, but we need the continued support and advocacy of all of our partners. This is mostly for when the slide is sent out where most of the data came from. So that is the end of my part of the presentation, but I'm happy to answer any questions when we get to that part of the presentation. Thank you.
Thanks, Shana. So I'm going to go back again to kind of looking at the federal level. Shana talked about a lot of things that they're doing locally, some hopeful things moving forward for Butte County, Paradise, and Chico, and what that looks like. And so through the Disaster Housing Recovery Coalition, we work with our partners to identify some of these areas that need improvement. You know, there's a lot of knowledge in that group, a lot of people on the ground who are working with survivors now, who have been working with survivors for decades, who have been working on recovery for a long time. And so part of what we do as a coalition is identify some of the repeating patterns that we've seen, because a lot of the issues that Shana mentioned happening in Butte County are not necessarily unique. You know, they're uniquely felt, obviously, by each person, but we see a lot of those patterns repeating over and over. And so we've worked together as a coalition to kind of think of some legislative fixes to some of these issues. And so I'm going to just talk about a few of those things, some of those proposals that are out now. And as much as you are able to do advocacy within your organization and your role, these are things that you can support and talk about. So the first thing is just authorizing the CDBGDR program. This will help make that 10-step process a lot shorter. It'll help states get their action plans out quickly. It can create some reserve funds that will allow HUD to put some money into communities early on, even before state action plans are finished, just for some very basic services like homelessness assistance. And we've had some really wonderful congressional champions around this issue, and Representatives Al Green from Texas and Ann Wagner from Missouri introduced a bill that would authorize the program and include some really important reforms and protection in the bill. And there should be a Senate companion bill, maybe as soon as tomorrow. I was hoping it would be introduced before the webinar, but it was not. And we're expecting Senators Brian Schatz from Hawaii and Todd Young from Indiana to introduce that companion bill, which would include a few different provisions, but more or less be very similar to the one that has already been introduced in the House. And it's really wonderful that this bill includes bipartisan support. The House bill actually passed out of the House Financial Services Committee unanimously, which in this current climate is, I think, something definitely to be celebrated. So first and foremost, this bill, these proposals would permanently authorize the program. That would mean that HUD does not have to put out a Federal Register notice with guidelines for each and every disaster. Those guidelines will be set. They can even kind of create some model housing programs for states to easily adopt and implement so that everything moves along much more quickly. States will still be required to, put together an action plan and have public comment, since again, each disaster is unique and the needs and damages will look different. And so it's important that the public and the federal government have some oversight of how grantees are going to be using that money to make sure that it's going where it needs to be. And so the bill would also make sure that the funding is really targeted to those with the greatest need. It includes several different key reforms, including equitable distribution of resources. So that's making sure that funding is used equitably between housing and infrastructure, as well as between homeowners, renters, and people experiencing homelessness. It would also prioritize the replacement of affordable housing, just making sure that naturally occurring affordable housing, subsidized housing is replaced as much as possible. And then it would also provide a clear appeal process for survivors if maybe they try to participate in a CDBGDR funded program and are denied. It would set out some clear guidelines to make sure that they receive any assistance that they are entitled to. Another kind of key area that the bill looks at is prioritizing data transparency and oversight. It can be really difficult for folks on the ground to know what's going on because there's not a lot of transparency. And like I said, oversight isn't necessarily the best always for CDBGDR. And I know, it had been discussed maybe looking at an office within HUD and making sure that there's ample staffing there. That could be a part of it. Also would just require HUD and grantees to share data with each other so that everybody is working from the same thing, as well as publicly, so that advocates and researchers who want to see the long-term impacts of all of this can easily access that data and look into impacts. It would also require the HUD Inspector General to oversee some of the spending so that we don't see it used for things like parking garages in the middle of nowhere. The bill also makes sure that civil rights and fair housing protections are strong for survivors. States would need to create a plan to ensure compliance with fair housing obligations, and HUD would need to release its data disaggregated by race and other protected classes. The bill would also encourage mitigation and resiliency, which is incredibly important. You're thinking about climate change and how disasters are increasing in magnitude and frequency. And so we want to make sure that if we're using federal dollars to help rebuild communities, that those homes are resilient so that we aren't just rebuilding and rebuilding and rebuilding, which has definitely been an issue before. So it includes some additional requirements around resiliency and mitigation. Another kind of legislative proposal that we've been working on is just utilizing the Disaster Housing Assistance Program, or DHAP. And this is a program that provides temporary rental assistance and wraparound counseling. It can be used similar to the Housing Choice Voucher Program, and it's particularly suited for low-income folks or people experiencing homelessness prior to the disaster. HUD and FEMA have to coordinate and enter into an interagency agreement to get this program up and running. And it was created after Hurricane Katrina and has been held up as a best practice after several different storms. Unfortunately, the Trump administration has refused to activate the program and instead has relied on TSA, which, as Shana mentioned, is a motel voucher program. And living in a motel for months on end is not a great solution. This would help put people in homes and provide the services they need to create long-term plans. I'll share this because I think it's just very indicative of the system. So in Florida, following Hurricane Michael, they were going to end the TSA program. or they have now, but they were ending it for some families at that point, and you had to prove that you were eligible for the program still by showing that you had a place to move. So if you had a place to move after 2 weeks, you were allowed to stay in the hotel. If you did not have a place to move, you were not allowed to stay in the hotel, and you were basically forced into homelessness. This is not a good model. It's really bizarre to me. And so the DHAP program is a much better solution and kind of provides the services and the resources that low-income folks really need. So we have worked with some congressional leaders, including Senator Elizabeth Warren from Massachusetts and Representative Adriano Espaillat from New York, to work on a bill that encourages FEMA to use this program more. So it would require HUD and FEMA to activate DHAP for survivors of recent disasters, which would be really helpful for folks who are still struggling to recover. And then it would also require them to determine whether DHAP is necessary after future disasters. So instead of FEMA being the sole decider, it really kind of loops HUD in. And FEMA and HUD have very different missions. And so it's important for low-income people that you have a few different agencies kind of thinking about this from different perspectives, and not just kind of the FEMA mentality of getting someone into somewhere. It's a much more short-term thing, which is incredibly important. But HUD is much more long-term, and it's great to have those folks thinking together about this. This bill that kind of looks at DHAP also addresses some of the barriers that low-income people face, specifically around documentation. So in Puerto Rico, after Hurricane Maria, we saw more than 77,000 people be denied for assistance because FEMA did not recognize the title system or the land use laws in Puerto Rico. And so you had tens of thousands of people denied assistance even though they definitely needed it. And so this bill is kind of looking at that issue. And it was not just an issue in Puerto Rico. I know it's an issue in Butte County now, where people don't have some kind of formal title, and maybe they're homeowners, maybe they're renters, people experiencing homelessness. They lack something kind of proving residency, and it prevents them from obtaining assistance. And so this bill would address that and make it a lot easier for folks, and put the burden more on FEMA to work with this, instead of on the low-income people who are already dealing with a lot. And lastly, just some kind of major areas where FEMA might need some reform, thinking about deploying assistance more quickly. Like Shana mentioned, a lot of the FEMA trailers and manufactured units weren't delivered in Butte County until months and months after the fire, and people were just sleeping in tents. Same thing happened after Hurricane Michael in Florida. FEMA also just needs to think about overcoming barriers and, again, take on that responsibility instead of putting the responsibility on survivors to overcome those barriers themselves. FEMA can look within their own system and see how they can make it better and more accessible for low-income people. There's also definitely some ways that they can strengthen oversight and transparency. We'd love to see FEMA share the data that they collect and have the Inspector General reviewing FEMA programs more often. Also just want to make sure that survivors are protected as far as fair housing and other civil rights violations. People with disabilities in particular have a very difficult time accessing FEMA assistance, and that's something that the agency could really do more on. Also just want to make sure that cost-effective models are promoted. The way they do housing assistance now is not necessarily the best way to use funds, and there are some better models out there, and we've been working with congressional leaders to look at some of those options. Also just want to make sure that transportation assistance programs are better. Again, this is particularly impactful for people with disabilities who might not be able, who might have some mobility issues. And then, of course, just thinking about protection against future disasters, this gets back to mitigation and resiliency. And we have a lot more information about all of these things on National Low-Income Housing Coalition's website, and I would be happy to share more resources with folks as well. So here's my contact information again, Sonya Acosta, and my colleague Noah Patton is working on this disaster stuff with me, and I've put Shana up here as well. So I believe it's time for questions now.
Great. Yeah, thank you both, Sonya and Shana. That was a really informative and important presentation. You know, I think a trend that's frustrating, but also understandable, especially when it comes to covering natural disasters, is how quickly they fall out of the news cycle, but, you know, how long the effects of them are lasting for communities. And so, you know, Shana just helping remind us all how damaging and impactful the Camp Fire was is really important. And then also as that ties to, you know, the work that Sonya and NLIHC are doing at the federal level of making sure that we can streamline the recovery process, I think it's just really, really important. So we are going to move into, we have about 10 minutes, a little under 10 minutes for some questions. I would just like to open up firstly kind of on something that has been touched on mitigation and resiliency. I'm just wondering, you know, as we move now towards, you know, fire season again, as we've already started seeing some like big storms coming and hitting the United States, I'm wondering what your two thoughts are, or what the two of your thoughts are on what, you know, what would have been helpful to have been happening at the community level, at the local level, you know, pre-Camp Fire, or as we head into another fire season. What things can be happening kind of on the ground that can help prepare our communities to better deal with natural disasters?
So I think there are definitely lessons learned, and the Town of Paradise's recovery plan has built in better evacuation routes, aggressive tree trimming, enhanced WUI standards, wildlife, urban interface building codes, because most of the town did meet the standards throughout California. I think that beyond that, this disaster was unstoppable because of climate change. And so a lot of our resiliency is about addressing the root causes of these disasters. So the things that we can do to harden structures, have better evacuation routes, good forest management are important and necessary, but these disasters are going to continue unless we address the root cause, which David mentioned at the beginning of this webinar. Over.
Great. And so just at unless Sonya would like to add something to that.
No, I think Shana hit it exactly. That's exactly right.
Yeah, great. And then so Shana, someone is also asking tangentially if you could just provide some clarification on the redesignation specific to Butte County and how that impacts the funds that you all are receiving.
Yeah, the redesignation was incredibly helpful. So the federal government, both the House and the Senate, pass an amendment that allowed the governor to redesignate the town of Paradise as rural until the census confirms it. So our population in the town of Paradise was over 26,000, which is the limit for USDA rural development programs. And so it was passed at the federal level. The governor went ahead and did redesignate the town of Paradise. What this does is it opens up the town to rural development dollars that will help support infrastructure, primarily the sewer system in the commercial district, which will allow building of multifamily housing and bringing back the mixed use and commercial buildings, and our water system. And then it will also allow CHIP to build single-family homes under the mutual self-help program, which is very exciting for us to be able to help bring back housing more quickly.
Great, thanks for that explanation. So we have another question, someone who's wondering, the issues that have been identified on the state and local levels, particularly related to state and local emergency management and housing agencies, and wants to know if there are any specific recommendations for them to improve policies and practices. So again, at the state and local level.
Sonya, do you want to start with that?
I don't really have too much to say on that, just since we really focus kind of at the federal level and thinking about improvement there.
So I think that from my experience and then going to workshops that have focused on Sonoma County's wildfire, I think that the coordination, the communication, the speed with which people respond, there are a huge number of incredibly smart, dedicated people that are coming to our area from the state, and I appreciate everything they're doing. However, for example, the Calhome disaster assistance funds that came out had really stringent guidelines on them that tied the hands of those of us who wanted to be able to use it. So it had, it was for housing, and so it had a 3-year turnaround because they wanted to get it up and running, but it didn't allow for long-term housing development. So it ended up going mostly to owner-occupied rehab, split between the county of Butte and the town of Paradise. And so there are some good intentions that sometimes aren't fully thought out with input from the community. So I think that better communication, direct input from the community, and streamlining would all be incredibly helpful. Also, in our region, we are trying really hard, and I think we're doing better than some other areas, to coordinate between jurisdictions. So the town of Paradise is the main disaster area, but the people who have moved out and are living in Chico and Oroville and in Glenn County, the neighboring county, and other towns, they're all impacted. And so how do we all work together to meet the needs and have a coherent long-term recovery plan where it's not just the city of Oroville moving forward with this plan and the city of Chico and the town kind of working on their own recovery? We're trying, but it could be better.
Great, thanks. And we are running up on the end of our time. So again, I just want to thank the two of you for being with us and presenting, and for everybody else who's listening in. Something that just is really, I feel, for me, has been highlighted here is this inextricable tie between natural disasters and not only housing, but the issue of homelessness, and also the tie to income and wealth inequality. And while a lot of this, is very heavy, I would just briefly want to circle back on, the points of positivity that both Sonya and Shana mentioned, both in how Butte County has been supported throughout this process through certain means, and also, the introduction of bipartisan legislation at the federal level. So there's definitely a way forward. Hopefully people are able to help go out and advocate for improved disaster response at the federal level. And, we thank you both for all the work that you're doing, and hope everyone else can try to, work to include more of it in the work that we do in our everyday. So thanks again for joining us, everyone. Next month, we will not be having a Restoring Neighborhoods webinar, but we will definitely be having one again in September. So we look forward to everyone joining us then. And until next time, thanks and have a great rest of your day.